when John hears this command to write his vision down, he then turns to hear who it is that is speaking to him. So he says, I turn to see the voice speaking to me, and on turn, he has this vision. Now, if you try to interpret this literally, you're going to come away with a pretty bizarre image of Christ. Okay, I like to encourage my students sometimes to actually take the book of Revelation and try to draw it. It's impossible. You'll end up with the most bizarre images if you try to take the words and draw them out on a page. But that's because it's not meant to be interpreted literally. The things that John is seeing are symbolic images. They represent other realities, right? So he's seeing these things, but they're symbols of other things, right? And you can actually see this in the very first thing he says. He says, I saw 7 golden lampstands. Now, pause there for a second. Although you and I, when we hear those words, might imagine like 7 candlesticks or maybe 7 oil lamps. For a first century Jew, when you talk about 7 lampstands, the first thing that would come to mind is the 7 branched candelabra of the menorah that was in the temple. So in the book of Exodus chapter 25, God commands the Israelites to build a 7 branched candelabra, which in Hebrew is called a menorah. And the menorah is the candlestick that illuminates the inside of the holy place in the ancient tabernacle of Moses, and then eventually in the temple of Solomon as well. So when John turns to look and he sees 7 golden candlesticks or 7 golden lampstands, to a first century Jew that would mean John is in the temple. That's the only place you see the menorah. It's in the temple, the 7 branched candelabra. In fact, even to this day, you might think, well, wait, I'm going to my Jewish friend's house and they have a menorah in their house. That's true, but it's 8 branches, not 7. The 7 branched one was reserved for the temple alone. Press pause in a second. We're going to come back to that vision. But if you go down to verse 20, I read that final verse of the chapter in order just to give you a little help with reading the book of Revelation. So when John sees Christ and Christ begins speaking to him, Christ is going to say some different things to him. And one of the things he says at the end, which isn't in the lectionary, but which is important, is he's going to explain the meaning of the symbol. So verse 20, it says, as for the mystery of the 7 stars which you saw in my right hand, and the 7 golden lampstands, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Okay, so notice here, it's not just me telling you that the imagery in Revelation isn't meant to be taken literally, that it's symbolic, right? That's not the point is. It's Christ himself telling John what you saw was a mystery. In other words, it points beyond, it's a visible sign that points beyond itself to something invisible. It represents something else. It symbolizes something else, okay? And in this case, the mystery of the 7 lampstands is that they represent the 7 churches. And the mystery of the 7 stars that Jesus is holding in his hand, and John sees in the vision, isn't that Jesus has gathered together, 7 balls of gas from the cosmos and put them in his hand. It's that those 7 stars, the vision he sees, represents the 7 angels of the 7 churches. And this is a fascinating aspect of early Christianity. In Judaism, at the time of Jesus, the book of Daniel and other texts testify to the belief that each people, each nation, like the nation of Israel, has an angel set over it to govern it, to guard it, to watch it, to keep it, right? And that gets translated into the early church with the belief that each church in each different city has an angelic guardian, an angelic patron, an angel that governs it and guides it, protects it, right? And this is where, sorry, I can't help it share this. This is where we get the idea of heavenly patrons for parishes too, and dioceses, okay? So, I go to the Church of St. Mary Magdalene. I go to the Church of St. Philip Neri. I go to the Church of, Our Lady of Perpetual Help, or whatever it might be. This is rooted in an ancient tradition of naming some kind of heavenly or angelic patron over a body, over a group of people, over a church. Okay, so Jesus himself is telling us that the image of the lampstands is a mystery. And so as you go back to read the description of what John sees, keep in mind, each of these things is a mystery. It represents something. It's meant to reveal some hidden truth about who God is, about who Christ is, and what John is seeing. So in this case, the vision, what does John see? If you back up, he says, I turned to see the voice, and what did I see? Number one, he saw 7 golden lampstands. And in the midst of the lampstand, number 2, one like a son of man. Who's the son of man? That's the heavenly figure from the book of Daniel, who comes riding on the clouds and receives the everlasting kingdom. Right? Number 3, he sees the fact that the Son of Man is clothed with a long robe and a golden girdle. It's a little funny. This RSV is a little antiquated here. We don't usually think of girdles as something men wear. It literally means a golden sash. Okay, so a band of cloth striped around him. Well, what are those? Those are the garments of the high priest. In Exodus chapter 28, the high priest has to wear a long linen robe and a golden sash. His hair and his head were white as wool. Wow, evidently Jesus went gray, right? After he went to heaven. No, this is a mystery. Who in the Old Testament has hair white as wool? Go back to the book of Daniel. When Daniel, in chapter 7, sees God, the Ancient of Days, he calls him, seated on the throne, it says his hair was white like wool. Okay? So this is a symbol of the antiquity of God, of the Ancient of Days, is what Daniel calls him. Right? And yet here the image is being applied to Christ. Very interesting. So he sees the menorah. In the middle of the menorah is the Son of Man. And the Son of Man looks like a Son of Man, but he also looks like the Ancient of Days. So is he the Son of Man or is he the Ancient of Days? Is he the high priest or is he the king? Well, you know, you got to think of this as layer upon layer of mysteries in the imagery that's given. And then the lectionary skips here down to verse 17 where it says, I fell at his feet as though dead. But I want to add in those other verses just for a second. When it says, his eyes were like a flame of fire, his feet were like burnished bronze, his voice was like the sound of many waters, and in his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth issued a sharp two-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. So each of these is a mystery, each is a symbolism, and usually, and here's the tip for you, when you're reading the book of Revelation, if you encounter something weird, strange, which you will, like a sword was coming out of his mouth, it doesn't mean that Jesus has an actual, sword made of steel coming forth from his mouth. It's a mystery. It's a symbol of some spiritual reality. And in this case, in Revelation, the key to unlocking the spiritual mystery is usually found in the Old Testament. So what does it mean to say he's got a golden sash and a robe? It reveals that he's the high priest. What does it mean to say his hair are white as wool? It means that he's the Ancient of Days, not just the Son of Man. What does it mean to say that he has a sharp sword issuing from his mouth? Well, if you go back to Isaiah 11, it says that the Anointed One, the Messiah, will destroy the wicked with the breath of his mouth. Like the word itself is a weapon of the Messiah, the word of God. When finally, it says he held 7 stars in his right hand, in this case, Christ himself actually interprets the mystery. He says the 7 stars are the angels. So Christ has authority over the angels of those 7 churches to whom John's writing. So I just give that to you as an example of how to slow down, unpack the book of Revelation, and realize that if you want to understand it, you have to understand the Old Testament. Now, with that said, you can understand why when John sees all this, like the sword coming out of his mouth and the stars in his hand and his hair white as wool and his face like burnished bronze, John's response is to fall at his feet as though dead. Now, this is striking because in the tradition, the author of the gospel and the author of the Apocalypse of John, the book of Revelation, the same John. So it's a striking difference between John's reaction to the earthly Jesus and John's reaction to Jesus in glory. In the earthly Jesus, John, the beloved disciple, lays his head in the bosom of Jesus, on the breast of Jesus, right, at the Last Supper. But when John the apostle, the same John, sees the risen Christ in power and glory, his response is not to lay his head on his bosom, it's to fall at his feet as though dead. He's overwhelmed by the glory. He's overwhelmed by the vision.